Class is in session.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Unlearn 16. Class is in session. Now today I've kind of been pushed in a direction for this podcast because I was gifted all of this. And if you can't see it, okay, there is magazine, Life magazine, Time magazine, newspaper clippings dating all the way back to the 1940s in the United States. And as I'm going through all of this and I'm sitting looking at it with my students, we really started to talk about how having something tangible like this, like actually touching this Life magazine, showing Jacqueline and Carolyn and JFK Jr. right at the funeral, or showing actual newspaper clippings of Nixon resigning or Truman taking over after FDR passed. Like all of this stuff, it emboldened my class to have deep conversations. And the cool part is these conversations are multifaceted. So we start talking about JFK. Well, of course they start talking about the assassination and the conspiracy theories and the angles, and all of a sudden we're talking about physics. But my kids also started talking about what did he actually do, because this magazine here, this Life, goes through what did he accomplish, or what do we perceive him to have accomplished throughout his presidency. Yet he really didn't actually get to that because the 1,000 days he was president wasn't enough time. And those particular things we give to him, we credit to him, like civil rights legislation, were actually LBJ. So then we start to talk about in my class the difference between what happened in perception of the past. And we were talking about what is more important. And this is fascinating. This is amazing. My students start to say, and this is so true because they start to compare it to the presidential race of today. My students start to say, perception matters more. And as I listen to them talk about how much perception matters, you can't disagree. Perception does matter more because if you think it's true, it really doesn't matter what is true. So my students start to talk about, well, how do you shift perception if people really don't care about what is true anymore? And it's so easy to lead. Because as we're talking about all these headlines, like Nixon resign, Truman calls in the SEALs, new president, Roosevelt passes, suspect in assassination of Dr. King is apprehended in London, like all of these amazing titles. They start to say, but Joanna, like we've already talked about what didn't they include and what's not in the newspapers or what's not on TV. So my students start asking me what's not in these headlines. Now that's a cool question. The cool question is to talk about the headlines and to use these actual pieces of history as moments. But the even cooler part is, how do we start to fill in the missing pieces of the puzzle? How do we get a more holistic picture? Because we all know that we're not getting the full picture, especially coming from US magazines talking about, US accomplishment. There they are landing on the moon. All of these amazing things. And then we pull this one up. It's official, and I'm not going to read the headline, but this racialized headline is incredibly problematic. So then we read this headline, and then you start to understand, oh my God, World War II and a lot of world wars are fueled by levels of racism and misperceptions and stereotype. Why? Because perception matters more than what is. Guys, my kids sometimes, my students blow my mind. Perception matters more than what is, because if you believe it and you act on it, it doesn't matter what really was. So then the question my students start to talk about when it comes to history and the way that we teach history and discuss history is we should be studying perception in that time context as much as we're studying what actually happened, because the perception of what happened and the perception of the people in that time and in that space actually perpetuated and caused action. So let's go all the way back. So I'm looking at all of these things, and the thing that was the oldest was the fact that FDR was a 4-term president. Now, a lot of people don't know that, but FDR got elected to his 4th term. There was no cap on how many times a president could run. And in his 4th term in office, he passed. Truman takes over, and then the whole sequence of events when Truman takes over and decides to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and plunges us into the Cold War, you have to wonder, would that have happened if FDR still was president? So we have that conversation. Not only do we have that conversation, but we also talk about what motivated people to put a limit on the presidency at that time. Because you might say, okay, fine, following FDR in his 4 terms, and they decided that it was too much and we needed to limit the presidency. Well, why? I mean, I don't know why. I've set my kids off to try to learn why, because there's the reality and then there's the perception. The perception is they wanted to limit power. They didn't want any kings. And the more that you're in power, the more power you accrue, and the more power you solidify, thus to stay in office. Okay, well, if that's true, it makes sense. But it wouldn't make sense for the Democrats to push that, would it? Or did they, in that time and in that space, was the United States and the power structure that existed sort of hoist and forced into a little bit more of a controlled power structure because the people in the United States were demanding that? I don't know. Because let's be honest, right after World War II and after the United States won World War II, I don't know how many people really find the need to limit presidential power after the president just served and did all of these amazing things. You want to know who would want to limit it? Corporations. In my opinion, that might have been a big push by corporate interests, specifically even some military industrial complex aspects that we're now going to roll into World War II because they don't want to have to go up against somebody that has more power than they do. So we're looking at all this, and then it launches us into a debate about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was it a war crime? Should they have dropped that bomb? Is that too many civilian deaths? Was there enough concern? Did the United States really think it was going to lose, or did they want to flex their muscle in order to prove something, not to Japan, but to the Soviet Union? Was the last act of winning that war against Japan really the first act of the Cold War? So my students debate this. And again, there's no finite definition, right? That's the brilliance and the confusion and sometimes the frustration when talking about human history. There's no one answer. There's only a multitude of options, and probably the truth is a whole bunch of them mixed together to formulate one. So we talk about all of this, right? And as we talk about the end of World War II, we then roll into JFK. And as we roll into JFK, my kids obviously talk about the assassination. Now, my students have talked about the assassination before. Okay, we've watched the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. We've dissected what was true and what was fiction. We've talked about, does the fiction matter more? We've built scale images of the assassination so that we can get the idea, the vantage point from the grassy knoll. My students have shown the magic bullet theory, both artistically and sort of physically, as they've sat students down, mimicking what it would have been like in the car. You got to know the JFK assassination is they're all in. I talk about that assassination, they are all in. Now, what they've started becoming more aware of is the aftermath. Initially, it was just about the shot. And eventually, my students started asking questions about okay, so when JFK was shot, And then Oswald was arrested. Then Oswald was shot, and Jack Ruby shot him, and he was put in prison. And then Jack Ruby died. And then we go through the 25 people, witnesses, that actually surround this case who have all mysterious heart attacks, stroke, car accidents. They've gone missing, right? And at that point, they start to really get an understanding of a level of a cover up. It doesn't matter who, if you want to say who did it, like we all have to sit down and go, there was a serious cover up. And what does that cover up mean? A lot of people spend a lot of time, and my students used to spend a lot of time trying to figure out the who and trying to figure out the how. But the key of history has always been, and it's always been the hardest part, to figure out the why. The men and women that were involved in that assassination are long but gone. We're not there to punish and to determine the individual. We're there to understand what was going to be caused, what world was going to be created by that assassination happening. And you talk about the military-industrial complex. And then my kids really start to dive into the intricacies of who owns the machine of war, who makes money from it, what companies make money from it. And we always tie it to today. And then you go deeper in that. If these companies were making money from it and they were making money from contracts, then of course, war is their business. And if war is their business, they have a vested interest in accelerating war. And that's what Eisenhower always warned everybody about. Eisenhower, a one-term president, obviously a commander. I don't know what his grade, a captain, somebody's going to yell at me on here when I don't know his station, an admiral, whatever his station was in war. He understood the military-industrial complex. He warned people against it. He said, be careful when you allow people to make money off war. They will create wars to make money. And look at what the Cold War was. Look at what the Cold War was. 60 years of spending and making money under the auspice of what? Fear. Fear of the nuclear bomb, fear that Soviets are going to attack, fear of the domino effect. Fear was the driving force. And then my students start to sit there, and this was all today, by the way. Then my students start to sit there and go, well, most big things that politicians do is on the heels of, or on the boot of fear. If we can make people afraid and we can give them a solution that only I can provide and solidify, they're going to give me everything. So then my students went home today and I told them to go read A Little Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, because Thomas Hobbes would say one of his most important sort of statements was the fact that people will give up all of their civil liberties as long as you are willing to keep them safe and keep their families taken care of. That fear is a huge motivator, that if you keep them safe, they don't care to be free. What? That's huge. That's huge. And I think that applies to many, many different people. And again, it's not about real. That fear isn't real. It never is real. That fear is always perception. So the creation of perception in your time and in your space gives you power. And if it gives you power, it's what also writes history that we then study and replicate without even questioning the underpinnings of, was it real? Because after we talk about JFK and we roll into the moon race, right? The space race. And we joke about all the people who deny that the United States landed on the moon, and then we blow past that. But what we talk about is this. What was the motivating factor for landing on the moon? Was it just exploration? And my kid said no. It was the height of the Cold War. It was a competition. And the Soviets did everything first. And the United States saw this as a perception of power. Now, there's some real power laced in there because if you can go to the moon, you can weaponize space. If you can weaponize space, you have first strike capacity and mutually assured destruction. Goes away. But besides that, it's a race for space because the country who can achieve it has a perceived level of power that is going to be more significant and more accessible and more enforceable than actual proof of said power. So, like, oh my God. So, getting to the moon actually just proved that they were strong. It only did it in pretense. And I said, yeah. And I said, and that was Kennedy's legacy, right? He started it, but he wasn't around to see it finished. He had been assassinated years prior. Following Kennedy's assassination, it wasn't in here. We talked about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., of Malcolm X. We talked about the who and the why. What world was going to be created in the aftermath, Bobby Kennedy. We talked about all of that. And then in the newspapers, it brought me to Nixon. Wow. The kids don't know a lot about Nixon. And the funny part about Nixon is you start to talk about, they know he was impeached. They kind of know why. So we talk about Watergate. We talk about why I'm coughing right now and I can't stop. We talked about breaking into the Watergate building, what that meant, what he got. And then we talked about the more important stuff. Fine. Watergate, you have the post finding out about it, breaking the story, all of the height of the reporting frenzy, all of that kind of things crashing down. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is as this hit the press and as Nixon was taken and questioned, they demanded, because people knew that Nixon actually taped everything that went on in the Oval Office. You weren't supposed to do that. He was doing it for two reasons, and I think more the latter than the former. Number one, for posterity. He wanted to write a really great memoir, and he wanted everything on tape. Number two, and I think this is more likely, he was horrifically paranoid. He thought everybody was out to get him. Nixon had the biggest bureaucracy in the White House, and he thought everybody was leaking. He thought everybody was a turncoat. Everybody was trying to undercut him. A lot of people think he had significant mental illness near the end of his term, if not earlier. And he recorded and then he kept them. Even when this story broke, even when the Watergate story broke, and as it broke, he had all of these tapes that Nixon could have burnt, right? Could have destroyed. He didn't. He said, I'm not giving the tapes because that's presidential immunity. Where have we heard that before? It's presidential immunity. I have immunity. I don't have to give you this. It's all like sorts of national security issues in those tapes. And the Senate said, and the Supreme Court said, you give them over. Now, here's the funny part. He still could have burned them. He still could have got rid of that evidence. He could have got rid of a tape or two. And instead, he hands them all over. And I think one of the famous quotes, he said, I was under medication when I decided not to burn those tapes. I find that hilarious. He's actually blaming medication for not breaking the law. That's how crooked he was. He actually said out loud that I would have broken the law had I not been medicated. It makes no sense to me. Again, none of this being equal. I also say to my students, but what else was Nixon doing? Nixon at that time, throughout his presidency, or near the tail end, was carpet bombing Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. Carpet bomb. And all with a secret slush fund of money without congressional approval. You want to talk about somebody that you should have been like, that's a crime. Not breaking into the Democratic national office. Who cares? Are you joking? Killing hundreds of thousands of people without congressional approval with secret money. That should be an impeachable offense. But as we know, the United States presidents do not get impeached for crimes they commit outside the United States. Well, therein lies also a big, big, big problem. And there's a big why, and my students start to ask that question. Well, the longer you commit crimes outside of your country, and you are not held accountable for said crimes because you are on the winning team or because you have more money or military power, how long until the world is tired of that level of hypocritical abuse of power? And some of my students say, well, that time is coming. In fact, you can see cracks within the United States itself, and I think still based on that premise. So we go through all of the Nixon stuff, the moon landing stuff. And actually, there's a very final piece, and I remember this well, but for them, they weren't even born yet. There's a full New York Times paper about 9/11. Now, the kids know the conspiracy theories about this. The kids, they're definitely more aware of aspects of that day. But we also talk about the who and the why. And now we are able to step back and get a little bit more context about during the Soviet, speaking going back to the the Cold War, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the United States gave weapons, money, and training to the Taliban in order to fight off the Soviets. And when there was a policy shift in the United States, they backed off, stopped giving money, training, weapons, and any kind of help, went back to the United States, and the Taliban got slaughtered. Fast forward to 2001, that is the revenge. Does it make it right? Of course not. Does it make it any less of a terrorist act? No. Does it give it context? Yes. And context is perhaps the single biggest important element when studying history, because context also isn't finite. I can raise some questions. My students can raise questions. Another teacher can raise questions. Nothing is perfect, right? So if nothing is perfect, you're never seeing the whole picture. You're only studying aspects of it. That's okay. Still has value to study. Just never forget you don't have the whole picture. You probably never will. So what does that mean? That means you always have to be open to new debates, new points of information, new pieces of information, new perspective, and new questions. Because if you're not open to that, you might as well stop talking about history, because you're no longer searching for the truth. You're searching for what fills your perception. And on that note, I'm going to qualify. I'm going to organize all of these beautiful, impressive pieces of history. I'm going to create a bit of a museum within our school so we can talk at open-ended conversations, no matter what class, about the why. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you next Tuesday. Same bat time, same bat channel. Dismissed.